A quiet morning. The sun, just risen above the horizon, begins to disperse the night's darkness, piercing through the dense foliage of the old trees. In their branches, the last raindrops still rustle, not yet evaporated by the coolness of the night. A gentle breeze stirs the grass and fills the air with a freshness, full of life and peace. Time seems to slow down here, and every moment is filled with special meaning. It was the perfect morning for a walk, and exactly the kind of day the old man and his faithful companion had been waiting for. The old man was no longer young. His face was covered with wrinkles that spoke of the years he had lived. He was a kind and caring person, always ready to help those in need. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of the town, near a park where he often walked with his dog, a German shepherd named Storm. There was no dog like her. She was devoted to her master with all her being. The old man and Storm were inseparable. Every day began with the old man, barely awake, going out into the garden, where his dog was already waiting for him, sitting where her favorite food had once been placed. Her black fur shone in the sunlight, and she seemed to be a part of that morning light, which seeped into their little world. Dogs of this breed are known for their loyalty, and Storm fully lived up to her reputation. Every step of the old man was important to her, every glance, every gesture. If the old man stopped, the dog immediately approached him, wagging her tail, and waited with gratitude for him to make the next move. Life was calm, and they enjoyed every moment spent together. Morning walks in the park had become their tradition. Storm ran alongside her master, often making quick circles, sometimes darting into the bushes and returning with some found object. In the evenings, they often sat on the old bench in the park, watching passers-by, how children played football, and the old ladies walking slowly down the alley with their dogs, swaying with their light, elderly gait. In those moments, the old man felt that his life was full of warmth and love. He didn't need anything more than this moment. He sat on the bench, his hand resting on the dog's back, and she, as if understanding the importance of the moment, sat quietly beside him, not distracted by the noise and bustle of the world around them. Storm always walked beside him, following him like a shadow. She was attentive and obedient, never straying far from her master. Her only desire was to be near him, to support him, to give him her love and care. They seemed like two halves of a whole. Wherever they were, in the park or on a quiet street, Storm always kept an eye on the old man and sensed his mood. If he was in the mood for a conversation, the dog would quietly sit beside him, wagging her tail, as though ready to listen too. The old man often laughed as he looked at his dog. He joked that if it weren't for Storm, his life would be much duller. And although the old man's words sounded like a joke, he knew well that he wasn't wrong. Storm was his only friend in this world. With her, he felt alive, a part of something bigger, a part of what gave him the strength to face each day. He often said to her, "You're my best company." And Storm, of course, didn't need words. She always answered him with a look full of love and attachment. When they walked through the park, the old man often stopped and watched his dog play. Storm happily ran, caught the ball, brought it back, sat down, and eagerly looked at her master, waiting for the next command. In those moments, the old man felt the peace that only the dog could bring. She was not just a pet. She was his friend and companion in life. They always returned home through the same park where they could sit on a bench and rest for a while. The old man sat down, stretched his legs, and Storm lay down beside him, resting her head on his knees. They sat, enjoying the silence, broken only by the occasional footsteps of passers-by. The old man often looked at his dog, not believing how much she meant to him. To him, she was the best friend who would never betray him, who would always be by his side, no matter what. The evenings were a special time for them. After long walks in the park, they returned home, where comfort and warmth awaited them. The old man prepared dinner for himself, and Storm sat beside him, waiting for her portion of food. The old man always made sure the dog felt comfortable. He took care of her, fed her meat, gave her treats, and sometimes spent time playing with her. Their evening always ended the same way. The dog lay at his feet, and they both fell asleep in silence and peace. But that day was different. He didn't know that it would be their last day walking together. This day was like all the others, full of love, devotion, and happiness. But, as often happens, life doesn't always warn you about what to expect. The old man and Storm didn't yet know that soon their lives would change forever. The dog could not foresee that one ordinary day would be the last. She was happy in that moment, and her only wish was to continue living as they always had. They walked along the alley where the old man was strolling slowly, and Storm was happily running alongside him, when suddenly something happened that marked the beginning of the end of their usual life. The old man didn't notice when he fell. Dogs rarely predict such things. But she sensed that something was wrong, and so, in that moment when the sky was still clear and the park's silence seemed eternal, the lives of these two, the old man and his dog, changed forever. That day started like any other. A foggy morning, a light breeze bringing with it the scent of freshness, and the usual walk through that very park. The old man and his faithful dog, Storm, walked along the familiar alley, their steps synchronizing with each other as they echoed on the asphalt. For them, it was a familiar route, requiring no thought or effort. In their world, everything was in its place. The old man moved slowly. His legs, although not as fast as in his youth, still kept him on his accustomed pace. He could feel his dog next to him, her energetic steps, light and fast, always following him like a shadow. Storm, as always, ran ahead, sometimes looking back to make sure her master hadn't fallen behind. She was always ready, always making sure the old man didn't feel lonely or forgotten. And that day, like every other, they and Storm enjoyed their usual routine. There was a cheerfulness in the air, especially when they approached the spot where the old man usually sat on the bench, and the dog, at that moment, loved running around the grass. It was their corner of the world, a small world where every moment was precious, where nothing and no one disturbed their peace. Here, there was no need for words. All that mattered was the feeling of each other's presence, the assurance that came with it. But suddenly, as if breaking that quiet and harmonious world, the old man stopped. Storm immediately sensed it. Her master became motionless. She came closer and looked at his face. Not immediately, but she noticed that something was wrong. This was the moment when the world seemed to slow down for her. She didn't understand what was happening, but her instincts made it clear. Something had gone wrong. The old man grabbed his chest and collapsed to the ground. His face contorted in pain and his body began to lose strength. He tried to say something, but his words couldn't break through the darkness that filled his mind. Storm didn't know what was happening, but her instincts screamed for action. She barked, her voice filled with panic. The dog couldn't understand what to do, running around her master, wagging her tail, as if trying to bring him back to life. She tried to help, losing all sense of time and space, but of course it was not enough. Soon, from a distance, the sound of sirens reached her. An ambulance finally arrived, and people began bustling around the old man. Someone tried to help him, and Storm continued running around them, whining and trying to get attention. Her soul, full of devotion, couldn't understand what was happening, why her master was losing strength so quickly, why they took him away from her without a word. She only felt that something important was gone, and she couldn't understand why. Time moved too slowly. The ambulance took the old man to the hospital, and despite all the efforts of the doctors, he never regained consciousness. The dog continued to sit by the hospital door, her gaze full of hope, but more and more it began to show signs of worry. She knew that everything wasn't as it should be. She waited, waiting for his return, and her heart was torn with pain. Storm couldn't understand why her master didn't return. She felt that he must come back because their life had always been like this. She had always known that if the old man went somewhere, he would always come back. However, that day, that didn't happen. This was the first signal to the dog that something in this world wasn't right. When Storm returned home, she went, as usual, to her food bowl, but food couldn't comfort her. The old man, as always, would be sitting in his chair, looking at her with a smile, petting her fur. But now he was gone. The house felt empty. The dog tried to find him everywhere, in the room, in the kitchen, in the garden where they often walked. But he wasn't there. She continued waiting, and this waiting was tormenting. Several hours passed, but everything remained the same. Silence, emptiness, and loneliness. The dog sat by the door, looking into the void, as if each gaze could bring her master back. But he didn't return. She couldn't understand why he wasn't there. She thought that perhaps he would soon walk through the door, and everything would be as it was before. But time passed, and hope faded. Storm couldn't understand what happened to her master. Why wasn't he there, as always? Why didn't he return from the walk, like he always did? In her world, there was no place for these questions, and she couldn't find answers. All that was left for her was to wait. And she waited. With each passing day, her waiting became more painful. More and more, Storm sat by the door, her eyes searching for him in every passer-by, in every sound. She could only hope that one day the old man would return. But that didn't happen. Storm didn't know that her master had left forever. She kept waiting, even though her hopes were growing more and more hopeless. She believed he would come back. Each day was like a new chance. Each evening, like hope for a reunion. Days and weeks passed, but for Storm, nothing changed. She continued to sit by the door, silently waiting for the old man to walk back in, as he always did, with a light step, a smile on his lips, and that warm look she loved so much. But the days grew longer, and the waiting became unbearable. At first, she didn't understand what had happened, not realizing the full weight of the loss, but with each passing day, her soul filled with emptiness that no sound or movement around her could fill. Storm waited, and the world around her continued to change, but she could not accept that her master was no longer by her side. Every morning, she still got up early and went to the door, hoping it would open and her master would return. All she knew was that her life had been full of his presence, and now, with his absence, she didn't understand how to continue. Dogs, like people, get used to a certain rhythm, to constancy, and every step of the old man had been her support. But now, that support had disappeared, leaving only a dark abyss of uncertainty. Storm continued to sit by the door, her gaze fixed on the place where light once entered when the old man walked into the house. She could sit for hours, staring into the emptiness, hearing nothing but her own breathing. Sometimes she would quietly whimper, as if calling to the sky, asking for her master's return. Sometimes she would get up and go to the window, as if the old man could approach and knock on the glass. But that didn't happen. Weeks passed, and Storm began to feel the heavy silence filling the house. She no longer heard the sound of the old man's steps, didn't see his soft movements in the chair, didn't feel the warmth of his hand gently stroking her head. She kept waiting, but gradually she realized that something wasn't right. Storm began searching for him everywhere, in the house, in the garden, on the street where they had often walked. She kept returning to the places they had shared, as if that could bring back their happy days. Time passed. Weeks, months. But the old man never returned. Storm became more withdrawn. She stopped playing with toys, didn't show interest in food. All her attention was focused on one thing, on waiting for him. She couldn't accept that he wasn't there. He had been her world, and now her world had become empty and silent. Passers-by began to notice the dog sitting by the door, as if she knew no other place, no other way. People would occasionally approach her, pet her, offer her food, or simply talk to her. She accepted their care, but her eyes always remained full of longing, because no one could replace her beloved master. Sometimes passers-by would ask the neighbors who the dog was, but no one knew her story. Only those who lived nearby understood that she was not just a dog. She was part of this house, part of someone's life. She waited. With each passing day, Storm felt her heart growing heavier. The waiting became painful, but she still continued to sit by the door. In her soul, there was only one thought: he will return. That was her last hope. But time passed, and with each month, that hope grew weaker. The world around her changed, but the dog remained in the same place. The passers-by who saw her every day became accustomed to her presence. They fed her, tried to cheer her up, but no one knew what this dog was going through, the loss that couldn't be understood unless you had experienced it. Storm didn't know how to live without the old man. For her, there was no meaning in continuing life if her world, her love, her master didn't return. The silence in the house grew almost oppressive. From time to time, Storm would get up and go to the window, hoping that perhaps the old man was finally coming. But she couldn't forget the moment when he didn't return from the walk, the moment when she heard the sirens and saw them take him away to the hospital. Storm didn't know what had happened, but her heart had already begun to understand. The old man would never be there again. Storm began to sit by the door more often, as if she could open it again and see her master. And every time she looked out at the empty street, it seemed as though he would appear at any moment. But that didn't happen. All that was left was to search for him with her eyes, to search for him in every movement, in every rustle, in every step passing by. Months passed. Storm could no longer believe that the old man would return. But her heart didn't give up. It kept beating in the rhythm of waiting. Even though her faith faded with each passing day, the dog still sat by the door, still searched for him in the eyes of the passers-by, in the faces of the people who tried to talk to her. Storm remained loyal to her master, even though he would never return. With each day, her loneliness became a deeper wound. But she continued to sit, believing that if she waited a little longer, the old man would surely return. She waited, and although time flowed and her hope slowly died, Storm couldn't accept that her world had changed forever. More than a year passed, and with each day, Storm sank deeper into her sorrow. Time, which once seemed so long, now felt eternal. She still sat by the door, every morning going to the window, gazing at the empty street, trying to spot the familiar figure of the old man in the distance. She acted as if she were waiting for him to return, someday, somehow. Storm didn't know what it was to forget. To her, her master was her life, and this world, without his presence, became meaningless. She continued searching for him in the faces of passers-by, in every step, in every gaze that passed by her window. But, as before, he was not there. With each passing month, Storm felt her body aging, but her soul remained tied to those days when they walked together through the parks, when the old man walked beside her, and she, following him, felt safe. All those days in her memory became like frames of a movie, which she watched again and again, trying to bring back those moments of happiness. Every moment with him was special, and nothing, not rain, not heat, not farewells, could change that. Passers-by, more and more, frequently noticed the dog sitting by the door. They started to feed her, bring her food, and sometimes children would try to pet her, but Storm remained silent and cold. Her gaze was always fixed on one point: the emptiness. Even the affection from people couldn't bring relief to her heart, which still grieved for her master. The dog became more and more withdrawn. Though she accepted their care, she couldn't forget him. Months passed, then years, but the memory of the old man remained alive in her mind. Those who came to the store or walked past the house had already gotten used to seeing Storm sitting by the door, as if she were forever waiting. Sometimes someone would ask why she sat so long in one place, why she didn't run around like other dogs. But no one knew her story. No one knew that this dog was grieving an unimaginable loss. Everyone saw her as just an ordinary dog, but her eyes, filled with longing and silent despair, could not simply be ordinary dog's eyes. 5 years passed. During that time, much had changed. The houses around, the streets, even the neighboring stores. But Storm remained in the same place. She didn't stop waiting, although she understood that her waiting had become more and more futile. Her body had aged, her fur had started to fade, and her legs moved with difficulty as though they too were losing all hope. But despite these signs of aging, her spirit remained strong. She continued to wait. Her loyalty hadn't disappeared, and this hope, though dying with each day, still lived in her heart. Passing people began to feed her, bring her some food or water, and sometimes just pet her. Storm accepted this with gratitude, but her eyes still held that same sadness as before. She looked at the faces of every person, hoping that maybe one of them was him, the old man. But even though she had become attached to the passers-by, Storm still waited for him, believing that he would return soon, that one day they would walk through the park again, and everything would return to its place. Time became strange for her. It flowed at its own pace, but she couldn't feel it. Whether it was morning or evening, whether it was hot or cold, to her it was all the same. She didn't know what happiness was without him, and she couldn't find solace in what now made up her world. Storm lived in the past, in those days when the old man had been by her side. Even for her, a dog who always followed him, always trusted him, the world without his presence was unbearably empty. The people around her had gotten used to her presence. She had become a part of this place. These streets, these stores, this small corner of the town where the old man and Storm had once been happy. But no one knew her true story. The people who passed by only saw the faithful dog sitting by the door, ready to wait until the end of her days. And that's how Storm spent her days, sitting, waiting, and hoping that one day everything would return to its place. She couldn't accept that the old man wasn't there. Storm had become an old dog. Her legs were no longer as fast, her fur no longer sparkled in the sun as it once had. Her movements had slowed, and her eyes had grown dim. But in them there still remained loyalty, which hadn't disappeared, despite the years of waiting. She had become a symbol of devotion, a quiet reminder of how strong her love had been, and how hard it was for her to lose the one she loved. She continued to live in this world, but her life was empty. Her world was empty, and that emptiness grew more and more palpable with each passing year. But everyone around, passing by, only saw her as a dog who, despite everything, continued to sit in her place, as if someone had told her that everything could still change. And Storm sat, not knowing that in reality everything had changed forever. Several more years passed. Storm had already become an old dog, whose legs could no longer run as fast as before. Her fur had faded, and in her eyes there was more and more often a sign of tiredness. But despite this, she continued to sit in that very place, by the door of the old house, near the store, at the corner of the street. Storm had become part of this corner of the city, part of its everyday life, although no one knew her story. Passers-by only saw a dog sitting by the door and perhaps perceived her as an ordinary street dog, having forgotten the past, eternal in her silence. But in reality, her soul remained tied to the old house, to the old man who had left her life. Time had been cruel. Years of waiting began to leave their marks. She sank deeper into her memories. But still, every day, as soon as she woke up, she would go to the window and look at the street. Maybe her old man would return, and everything would go back to normal. And every day she lost hope, but she never lost her loyalty. She remained in her place, waiting. This corner, this place, had become her world. She, as always, waited for him. But her master no longer came. Passers-by began to notice the dog. At first they were random people who, due to their everyday concerns, simply saw her when they walked by. They turned around, noticing that the dog was still there, and started feeding her, throwing her scraps of food. Sometimes someone would bring her water, someone would pet her, and someone would even sit next to her, spending a few minutes with her, even though they didn't know who she was or her story. To them, she was just an ordinary dog, who had sat in the same place for years, like a faithful sentinel, with nowhere else to go. Storm accepted their care with gratitude, but her gaze always remained distant. She didn't try to get closer, didn't try to show any particular affection. She was grateful for the attention, but her heart was occupied with only one thing: waiting for the old man. She perceived these people as passing strangers, who could not replace what she had lost. And, despite the attention she received, her inner world remained empty. She continued to live in the memory of the past, in the place where the old man was still beside her. Over time, the number of people who noticed Storm grew. Locals began stopping more frequently by the store to pet the dog, to feed her. New faces came every day. Sometimes children would bring her toys, try to play with her, but she would only lazily watch them. Storm understood that her world was no longer the same as before, and she couldn't bring back those days when everything was in its place. But despite this, her heart still held warmth and loyalty to her master. Gradually, the dog became a symbol of the neighborhood. People passed by, and for them, Storm became something constant, something unchanging, like an old bench in the park or an endlessly glowing street lamp. But Storm was more than just a dog. She was a reminder of how strong devotion is, how alive her love was, and how silently she waited for her master. And then, one day, local media took notice of this dog. Someone from the press, passing by chance, saw people stopping to pet the dog and wondered, "Why is this dog still here? Why hasn't she left?" He decided to film a short report on the dog's loyalty and her incredible story. When the video about Storm was first posted online, it immediately attracted the attention of viewers. People were touched by her story, her devotion, and her waiting. This was the moment when everything changed. The video went viral. It quickly spread on social media, and people from all over the city, and later from other places, began coming to see Storm with their own eyes. They came, bringing her food, toys, and affection, but no one knew what was truly in the heart of this dog. People didn't know how heavy her pain was, how long she had waited, and how much had been invested in this waiting. But they knew one thing: she was loyal, and that touched their hearts. Storm became a real local celebrity. People gathered near the store to see her and share their stories, to talk with this old dog who had become a symbol of love and devotion. People often came with their children so that they could pet the dog, play with her, and enjoy her silent but warm presence. Every person who stopped by left something: food, a toy, or sometimes just their warmth. Storm, despite all this attention and care, remained cautious. She accepted affection, but her heart was always with the one she loved. But still, every day she felt that something new was appearing in her life. Maybe she could start trusting people, maybe she could learn to find comfort in their care, but that didn't mean she stopped waiting for her master. For the love she gave him was eternal. With each day, Storm grew older and her body lost its strength, but her soul remained loyal and unchanged. People fed her, brought her toys and blankets, trying to make her last years a little more comfortable. But that lingering sadness stayed with her forever. She had learned to live with it, but her devotion and love for her old master remained unshakable. Even when there were many people around her, Storm still felt lonely, because her heart was tied to one person who would never return. Several months had passed since the local press took notice of Storm. It all started with a simple video that one of the local TV stations posted online. In this video, the dog sat by the door, as always, and her calm but full of longing expression caught the attention of thousands of people. A storm of discussions began on social media. People started commenting, sharing the video, and soon it went viral. Storm, the loyal dog waiting for her master, became a symbol of love and devotion. With each day, the interest in Storm grew. Reports about her began appearing in the news, and people from all over the city started coming to the store to see the dog with their own eyes. They brought her food, toys, and even shared their stories of loyalty and love for their pets. A spark returned to Storm's eyes, a spark of hope and trust. Although she continued waiting for the old man, her heart, though still holding on to him, began to feel some warm attachment to these people. They cared for her, brought her joy that she had been so lacking. But despite all this care, Storm was still deeply tied to what had been. She accepted the offerings of people with gratitude, but her soul had no room for new masters. She couldn't forget the one who had been so dear to her. Each new face that came brought her some comfort, but also reminded her that the old man wouldn't return. She continued sitting at that very spot, staring into the emptiness, waiting for him. But now, people began to notice her and bring their love, and although this love wasn't the same as before, it brought some relief to Storm. The local media began to follow Storm's story. The reports became increasingly popular, and soon the interest in this dog turned into a real mass movement. People gathered at the store to see Storm, to meet her in person and thank her for the incredible loyalty she had shown to her master. She became a well-known figure, but despite the attention and respect, she remained attached to her past. Every day, new faces came to the store. The elderly, young people, families with children, all wanted to see the dog who had sat by the door for many years, waiting for her master. They fed her, petted her fur, shared stories about their pets, but for Storm, it was still not what she so dearly wished for. She couldn't forget the old man. She couldn't release her attachment to him. But she began to perceive the people who came as part of her world, as those who brought her at least some joy in her solitude. The local media decided to do a full report about Storm. Cameras filmed her every day, her slow movements, her gaze, which was full of sorrow and wisdom. Storm became a true city celebrity, and her story soon spread across the country. People began coming to the city specifically to see the loyal dog. Many brought her soft toys, blankets, and even built little houses for her near the store. Storm accepted their care, but her heart remained tied to the old house where her master once lived. With each passing day, Storm became a symbol of devotion and loyalty. People came to see firsthand how the dog, despite years of solitude, continued to sit in the very place where her master once was. She became an inspiration for many, and her story sounded like a lesson for all who had ever lost someone important in their lives. She became the embodiment of strength of spirit, despite the pain and loss. But despite all the attention and care, Storm remained loyal only to one person. She continued sitting by the door, waiting. Sometimes when people passed by, she would stir, approach them, receive a dose of love, but her gaze always remained fixed on one point. She was grateful to everyone for their care, but her heart was closed to all but one, the old man. And this loyalty never weakened, despite the years, despite all the care she received. Storm learned to live among the people who loved her, but her soul remained captive to what had once been her world. People came and went, but she continued sitting by the door, like a symbol of infinite devotion and love, not knowing that her master would never return. In this waiting, in this constant attachment, Storm remained unchanged, despite all the external changes around her. The local media continued filming reports, and Storm grew more and more popular. But for her, all this fame felt alien. She didn't seek recognition. She simply waited. And in this waiting, in this loyalty, she remained a true symbol of love that knows no time, no boundaries, and stays with us, even when everything around changes.